Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you love and realized they're not really there anymore? That's how it felt when Elise came back from that hypnosis retreat. She looked the same, smiled the same, but something was missing. And late at night, when she whispered a stranger's name in her sleep, I knew I was losing her to something, or someone I couldn't understand. This is the story of how I fought to bring her back, and the terrifying truth I uncovered along the way. Before the hypnosis retreat, life with Elise was the kind of peaceful that some people spend years trying to build. We had our rhythms: Saturday morning coffee on the porch, Sunday dinner with her parents, and a midweek habit of watching old sitcoms together before bed. She was the dreamer, always searching for something deeper, while I was the realist who liked things to stay simple. Elise was always interested in self-improvement. Our bookshelf was lined with titles like Unleash Your Potential and The Path to Inner Peace. She had tried yoga, meditation apps, and even a month-long journaling challenge. None of it ever stuck for long. When she told me about the hypnosis retreat, I thought it was just another one of her projects. "It's only 2 days," she said, eyes glowing. "They use deep hypnosis to help you let go of emotional baggage and rediscover your true self." I raised an eyebrow. "Hypnosis? You really believe that stuff works?" She grinned and shrugged. "Why not? Maybe you should come too. Loosen up a little." I laughed it off, imagining myself in a room full of strangers getting hypnotized like a stage act at a carnival. "I think I'll pass." Elise didn't push it. She packed her bags that Friday and left with a cheerful wave. "You'll see," she called from the driveway. "When I come back, I'll be lighter." I spent the weekend enjoying the quiet. I mowed the lawn, watched a baseball game with a beer in hand, and took my time making a steak dinner, medium rare, just how I liked it. I even caught myself thinking that maybe Elise's retreats weren't so bad after all. When she walked through the door Sunday evening, I was ready for her usual excitement, the kind where she'd hug me and talk a mile a minute about everything she learned. But this time, she was different. "Hey, you're back." I greeted her with a smile. "How was it?" She dropped her suitcase by the door and walked straight into my arms, wrapping herself around me like she hadn't seen me in years. Her embrace felt intense. Too intense, like she was holding on for something more than comfort. "It was amazing," she whispered. I pulled back slightly to look at her face. Her expression was calm, but her eyes had a strange softness, almost like she was daydreaming while standing right in front of me. "Tell me about it," I said, leading her to the couch. She sat down, staring at the wall for a moment as though she was reliving something. Then she smiled, a slow, almost wistful smile. "It wasn't just a retreat, Mason," she said. "It felt like waking up. They help you peel back the layers of yourself you didn't even know were there." "Layers?" I asked, unsure what she meant. She nodded, her gaze distant. "The hypnotist was incredible. He had this voice that made you feel like you could let go of everything. I don't even know how to explain it, but I feel free." Her words were supposed to sound uplifting, but something about the way she said them unsettled me. "What do you mean by free?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes bright, but foreign somehow. "Free from doubts. Free from everything that used to hold me back." I wanted to be happy for her, but something didn't feel right. Elise had always been a person full of emotions: excitement, frustration, nervousness, joy. But now, she was too calm, almost empty. That night, we went to bed like we always did. She kissed my cheek, whispered goodnight, and turned over. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. Her breathing was slow and steady, like she was completely at peace. But at some point in the night, I woke up to the faint sound of her voice. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep. She did that sometimes after a long day. But this time, the words were different, too soft to make sense of. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. She was murmuring something, repeating it over and over. A name. I froze, listening as my heart thudded in my chest. "Elijah. Elijah." The name slipped from her lips like a secret. I didn't know anyone named Elijah. I sat there, staring at her peaceful face as she slept, my mind racing. Who was Elijah? Why was she saying his name? I told myself it was nothing, just a dream, a fragment of some nonsense thought. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't random. Something had changed in Elise, and I was about to find out what. The next morning, Elise was already up when I stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The smell of coffee filled the room, but instead of the usual clatter of mugs and conversation, there was an unsettling stillness. She stood by the window, staring out at the backyard with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. She didn't even notice me come in. "Morning," I said, forcing a casual tone. She turned her head slowly and gave me a soft smile. "Good morning." Something in her expression felt off. Too serene, almost rehearsed. Elise was a morning person, sure, but she was never this composed. Usually, she was a flurry of activity, juggling breakfast and emails, telling me about her plans for the day. Now, she seemed like someone else entirely. "You sleep okay?" I asked, studying her as she sipped her coffee. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I slept beautifully." The word felt strange. When was the last time anyone described sleep as beautiful? I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, trying to shake the unease that settled in my chest like a stone. "So," I began, attempting to sound lighthearted. "Who's Elijah?" She froze mid-sip. For a second, the mask of serenity slipped, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, confusion, maybe even fear. Then she set her mug down and smiled again, a little too wide. "Elijah," she repeated, her tone airy. "I don't know anyone by that name. You were saying his name in your sleep last night." I kept my voice even, though my heart pounded in my chest. "Over and over." Elise blinked, then let out a soft laugh, the kind of laugh you give when you're trying to brush something off. "It must have been a dream. You know how dreams are. They don't mean anything." "Yeah," I muttered, staring into my coffee. "Maybe." But her explanation didn't sit right with me. Elise was never the type to talk in her sleep, let alone repeat the same name like some kind of chant. The day carried on, but my mind was stuck in a loop. I watched her closely, probably too closely. She moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and graceful, as if she were trying not to disturb anything. By the time dinner rolled around, I was restless. Elise had barely spoken to me all day. When I asked if she wanted to order takeout, she simply nodded, lost in thought. We sat in front of the TV with cartons of Chinese food, but she barely touched hers. Instead, she stared blankly at the screen while a sitcom laugh track echoed through the room. "Elise," I said, breaking the silence. She looked at me, her expression soft but distant. "Yeah, you've been quiet." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Ever since you came back. I mean, even more than usual." Her eyes softened, and she reached for my hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you." "It's not about that," I said. I feel like I don't know what's going on in your head right now." Elise squeezed my hand gently. "I'm fine, Mason. Really." But she wasn't. I could feel it in my bones. There was something brewing beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling me. That night, I lay awake, listening to her steady breathing beside me. I wondered if she'd murmur that name again. But she didn't. I stared at the ceiling for hours, haunted by the sound of that unfamiliar name slipping from her lips. Elijah. Who was he? A person from her past? A figure from some old memory? Or worse, someone new? The next morning, Elise left early for work. I stood by the window and watched her car disappear down the street. The house felt emptier than ever. Every time Elise whispered his name in her sleep, I felt like I was falling deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the most shocking part wasn't that she was haunted by the hypnotist. It was the reason why, and what I found out when I confronted him. If you think you'd do anything for the person you love, ask yourself this. How far would you go if their mind wasn't really their own anymore? Unable to sit with the unease any longer, I grabbed my laptop and started typing. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just something to explain the gnawing feeling in my gut. I searched for the name Elijah in connection with the hypnosis retreat. Nothing relevant came up, just a bunch of random articles and names that didn't mean anything. I clicked through forums, blogs, and social media posts, hoping for a lead. Then I found something strange. It was a post on a message board for people who had attended similar retreats. The author described their experience with a particular hypnotist, a man who was known for breaking down emotional barriers in ways that left some people feeling dependent. The post wasn't long, but the phrasing caught my attention. His voice stays with you. Even after you leave, it whispers to you in your dreams. So people say they feel connected to him, like he unlocked something in them that can't be shut off. My pulse quickened as I read the comments underneath. People shared eerily similar stories, talking about how they dreamed of him, heard his voice in their thoughts, and even felt as though he was a part of them. It felt ridiculous. Hypnosis was just suggestion, right? Harmless tricks to relax the mind. But the more I read, the more unsettled I became. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever happened to Elise at that retreat, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know how deep it went. By the time Elise came home that evening, I had read every forum post, blog, and article I could find about the retreat and the hypnotist behind it. His name was Dr. Elijah Crow. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Elijah. I stared at the name on the screen, feeling like I'd walked straight into a nightmare. A part of me had been hoping it was a fluke, just a coincidence. But there it was, plain as day. The name Elise whispered in her sleep belonged to the man who led the retreat. The same man described in post after post as charismatic, intense, and life-changing. I closed the laptop just as Elise walked in, her hair windblown and cheeks flushed from the cold. She greeted me with a soft smile and set her bag on the counter. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual despite the storm brewing in my chest. She nodded. "Exhausting." I wanted to scream, to demand answers. Who was he to her? What had he done to her? But instead, I swallowed my anger. I needed to be smart about this. If I pushed too hard, she'd shut down. We went through the motions, small talk over dinner, a show on TV. But my mind was somewhere else, replaying every word from the forum posts. He unlocks parts of you. You'll never forget him. The people who wrote those things made it sound like he wasn't just a man, but some kind of savior or predator, depending on who you asked. When we went to bed, I waited for Elise to fall asleep, her breathing soft and even. I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting, and then I heard it again. Elijah. It was softer this time, like a secret slipping from her lips. I felt something break inside me. My wife, my Elise, was dreaming about another man. But not in the way you'd expect from an affair. No, this was worse. There was something almost reverent in the way she said his name, like he was woven into the fabric of her thoughts. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched her sleep. Her face was serene, peaceful, so at odds with the storm of emotions inside me. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently shaking her shoulder. "Elise," I whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. "Mason? What's wrong?" "You were talking in your sleep again," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said his name, Elijah." Her eyes sharpened for a second, just a second, before the softness returned. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just a dream." "Elise, who is he?" I asked, unable to hold back any longer. "Is he someone important?" She blinked, looking genuinely confused. "Mason, no. I don't even know an Elijah." "But that's the name of the hypnotist," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Dr. Elijah Crow. You didn't think to tell me that." She sat up now, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't think it mattered. I mean, yes, that's his name, but I didn't." She trailed off, frustration flickering across her face. "I don't even remember my dreams half the time." I felt like I was going insane. The woman I knew, the one who would have laughed off something like this, was slipping away from me. "Elise," I said quietly, "do you feel different since you came back?" Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. "Maybe a little," she admitted. "It's hard to explain. It's like, after the retreat, I feel lighter, freer. But also, I don't know, disconnected?" I offered. She nodded slowly. "Yeah." I reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I just want to understand, Elise. I want to help." She squeezed my hand, but didn't meet my eyes. "Maybe it's just in my head," she whispered. "Maybe I'm overthinking it." I nodded, though I didn't believe that for a second. Something had happened to her, something I didn't yet understand. That night, after she drifted back to sleep, I sat in the dark, trying to piece together the truth. If Dr. Crow's hypnosis was as powerful as people said, had he done something to her mind? Had he planted something in her thoughts? Something she couldn't even control? The idea chilled me to the bone. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. Elise left for work, and I returned to my laptop. This time, I wasn't just reading forum posts. I was looking for contact information. It didn't take long to find it. A glossy website for the retreat listed Dr. Crow's credentials, along with a sleek photo of the man himself. He looked exactly how I'd imagined. Handsome, confident, with sharp features and an unsettlingly intense gaze. I scrolled past the promotional text until I found a contact form at the bottom. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I debated what to write. In the end, I kept it simple. Dr. Crow, I have some questions about your recent retreat. My wife attended and seems changed. I need to understand what happened. Mason. I hit send and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. For the rest of the day, I waited for a response, checking my email every 10 minutes. Nothing. By evening, I was pacing the house, unable to focus on anything else. Then, just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Dr. Crow. The subject line read, "We should talk." I stared at the message, my pulse racing. Whatever this was, I had the feeling it was only the beginning. The email was brief. "Mason, I understand your concerns. I'll be available for a private video call tomorrow at 2 p.m. Let's discuss this directly. Elijah Crow." Seeing his name in print made my stomach twist. His message was polite, almost formal, but there was something unsettling about how quickly he responded, as if he'd been expecting me. The next day, I sat at my desk, staring at the clock as 2 p.m. approached. My laptop screen was open, waiting for the video call to begin. My palms were sweaty, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't just some random appointment. This was the man who had somehow wormed his way into my wife's subconscious, who had made her whisper his name in the middle of the night. At exactly 2 p.m., the screen flickered, and there he was. Dr. Elijah Crow looked even more unsettling in motion. His sharp features were framed by dark hair that was neatly combed back, and his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, felt like they could see right through me. He wore a tailored blazer over a crisp white shirt, exuding the kind of calm confidence that made people listen. "Mason," he greeted me with a warm smile. "Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your concern." I cleared my throat, trying to mask my unease. "I didn't reach out to be polite, Dr. Crow. I'm worried about my wife." His expression softened, as though he'd heard this 1,000 times before. "Elise, right? She spoke very highly of you during the retreat." The mention of her name made my fists clench. "She's not the same since she came back," I said bluntly. "She's distant, distracted, and she keeps saying your name in her sleep." Crow's smile didn't falter. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, folding his hands in front of him. "Mason, hypnosis is a powerful tool, but it's also deeply misunderstood. When someone experiences true emotional release, it can leave them feeling raw, vulnerable. Sometimes the subconscious clings to a guide, a voice that represents safety." "Safety," I repeated, my voice tightening. She didn't come home feeling safe. She came home obsessed. He held my gaze without flinching. "What you're describing is an obsession. It's something much more subtle, a form of transference. It's not uncommon for clients to feel emotionally tethered after a transformative session." "Why you?" I asked, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why does she dream about you? Whisper your name? What did you do to her?" Crow let out a soft sigh, like a man who had to explain the same difficult truth over and over. "I didn't do anything to Elise, Mason. She unlocked parts of herself during the sessions, parts she had buried for years. Sometimes, when those doors open, the mind associates that freedom with the person who guided them there." "So, what? You're saying she's in love with some idea of you?" "Not love," he corrected gently. "Recognition, trust, a sense of liberation." I shook my head, anger replacing my fear. "That's not liberation. That's manipulation." Crow's expression hardened for the first time. "Mason, hypnosis isn't mind control. Elise chose to go on this journey. She chose to let go of her fears and doubts. Whatever she's experiencing now is part of that process." "That's convenient," I spat. "You get to be the hero in her head, while I'm left watching my marriage fall apart." For a moment, silence hung between us. Crow leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You love her," he said quietly. "That's obvious. But the harder you push, the more you risk reinforcing her attachment to the retreat experience." I gritted my teeth. "So, what am I supposed to do? Just sit back and let you live rent-free in her head?" Crow's gaze softened again. "No. You remind her who you are. You remind her why she chose you in the first place. The connection she feels to me is temporary, Mason. But your connection with her? That's real. His words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Instead, they felt like a challenge. I closed the laptop without saying goodbye, unable to stand looking at his face any longer. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, trying to process everything. Crow's explanation made sense on a logical level, but my gut screamed that it was more than that. Elise wasn't just experiencing emotional transference. She was slipping away from me. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to realize it. That night, I watched her as we sat at the dinner table. She laughed at something I said, but it felt hollow, like she was playing a part. "Elise," I said gently, setting down my fork. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up curious. "Of course. Do you ever think about the retreat?" Her face softened. "All the time," she admitted. "It was life-changing." "Do you think about him?" I asked carefully. Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The hypnotist. Crow." She hesitated for just a moment, a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "but not in the way you think." I swallowed hard. "Then how?" She looked down at her plate, as though searching for the right words. "He made me feel like I could be someone else. Someone stronger. Someone who wasn't afraid." My heart ached at the way she said it, as though she'd been carrying that fear for years, and I'd never even noticed. "Elise," I said softly, "you've always been strong. You don't need someone like him to tell you that." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her touch was warm, familiar, but also distant. "I know you mean that," she whispered, "but it feels different when you believe it for yourself." I wanted to shake her, to make her see that she didn't need Crow or his words to feel whole. But I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, holding her hand, wondering how much of the woman I loved was still mine, and how much had already been taken. The days that followed felt like I was living in someone else's life. Elise floated through the house like a ghost, present but unreachable. She still smiled at me, still kissed my cheek before bed, but it felt rehearsed, like she was playing the role of a loving wife rather than being one. I found myself obsessing over every detail. The way her gaze drifted off during conversations, the distant hum of a song she sometimes hummed under her breath, one I didn't recognize. At night, I'd lie awake, waiting for her to speak in her sleep, hoping for silence but bracing myself for that damn name. Elijah. Every time she whispered it, it felt like a dagger, slicing deeper. The worst part was that I couldn't even be mad at her in the normal sense. She wasn't sneaking around or hiding anything, not intentionally, anyway. Instead, it felt like she was being pulled by invisible strings, and I was helpless to cut her free. On the fourth day after my call with Crow, I found her sitting in the living room, cross-legged on the floor with a notebook in front of her. She was writing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you working on?" I asked, keeping my tone casual as I walked in. She looked up, startled, and quickly closed the notebook. "Just thoughts," she said with a small, apologetic smile. "Elise," I said, lowering myself to sit across from her. "Can I see?" Her smile faded, replaced by something guarded. "It's personal," she said softly. Something in her voice, a mix of guilt and hesitation, made my stomach churn. I forced a smile and nodded. "Okay, I get it." But I didn't. "Not really." She left the room to get a glass of water, and I stared at the closed notebook on the floor. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was wrong. But curiosity and fear battled in my mind until I reached for it. I flipped it open to the most recent page, my heart pounding. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. Her words weren't full sentences, just fragments of thoughts that hit like punches to the gut. "I feel seen, heard, freed." It's like he knew me before I knew myself. I didn't expect to miss his voice. Am I a bad person for feeling this way? I closed the notebook so fast that it made a soft thud. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just admiration. It wasn't even simple transference. This was something deeper, something I wasn't sure I could fix. She was slipping away, and she knew it. When Elise came back into the room, she paused, noticing the tension in my face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to beg her to come back to me. But instead, I forced myself to smile. "Yeah, Elite. Everything's fine." She smiled back, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Doubt. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, I opened my laptop and stared at Crow's email. His words played in my head. "Remind her who you are. I needed to do more than that. I needed to remind Elise of who she was, before Crow twisted her thoughts. I scrolled through the retreat's website, looking for something, anything, that might explain how Crow sessions worked. I read everything about guided visualizations and emotional breakthroughs, but it was all vague jargon that could mean anything. Then I saw it. Private sessions are available for those seeking deeper, personalized journeys of self-discovery. Private sessions. My stomach turned. Had Elise been part of one of those sessions? Had Crow singled her out, weaving himself into her mind under the guise of helping her? The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was worse than anything I could have imagined. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. My wife had walked into that retreat hoping to better herself, to let go of whatever burdens she'd carried. Instead, she'd come back chained to the very man who claimed to free her. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit back and watch Crow take my wife away from me. If he had his hooks in Elise's mind, I'd find a way to pull them out, even if it meant confronting him in person. The decision to confront Crow wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Elise was slipping further away from me with every passing day, and I couldn't let that happen. The next morning, Elise sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and flipping through her phone like it was any other day. Her hair was tied back, and she was humming again, that same unfamiliar tune that made my skin crawl. I set my coffee mug down and took a deep breath. I'm going to drive out to the retreat. Her head snapped up, confusion flashing across her face. What? Why? I need answers, I said calmly, though my heart was pounding. About what happened there. Elise's eyes widened. Mason, no. That's crazy. Is it? I asked, leaning forward, because I've been watching you drift further and further away from me since you came back. And I'm not imagining it. You've changed, Elise. She looked down at her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. My voice softened. You're not the same person who left for that retreat. You barely talk to me. You've shut me out, and you're still thinking about him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she whispered, "It's not what you think." Then what is it? I asked desperately. Help me understand, Elise. Please. She wiped her eyes and shook her head. He made me feel free. For the first time in years, I wasn't scared. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I felt strong. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You've always been strong, Elise. You didn't need him for that. She looked at me with so much sadness that it made my chest ache. But I didn't believe it until he showed me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just talking about hypnosis. She was talking about something deeper. I'd failed her without even realizing it. Elise, you don't owe him your trust or your thoughts, I said firmly. He's not some savior. He's just a man who got inside your head. She bit her lip, silent, but visibly torn. I reached across the table and took her hand. Let me help you, I pleaded. For a moment, I thought she might agree. But then she pulled her hand away and stood up. I need some air, she muttered before grabbing her coat and walking out the door. I watched her leave, helpless and heartbroken. The drive to the retreat felt surreal. The further I drove, the more isolated the road became. Thick trees lined the highway, and the sky was an overcast gray that made everything look muted. When I finally pulled up to the retreat, I was surprised by how normal it looked, almost serene. A cluster of cabins nestled around a small lake, with a gravel path winding between them. There was no sign of anything sinister, no eerie atmosphere. It was the kind of place that would have felt peaceful if I didn't know what had happened here. I stepped out of the car and headed toward the main building. Inside, everything was quiet except for the faint sound of soft music playing in the background. A receptionist at the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Dr. Crow," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her smile faltered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I replied. "But he'll want to see me." Her brow furrowed. But before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "It's okay, Emily." The receptionist turned, and there he was, Dr. Elijah Crow, stepping out from a nearby hallway. He looked exactly the same as he had on the video call, calm, composed, and far too confident. "Mason," he greeted me with a small smile. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, well, I've had enough of waiting." He nodded and gestured toward a door to the side. "Why don't we talk privately?" I followed him into a small office with large windows overlooking the lake. He closed the door behind us and motioned for me to sit, but I stayed standing. Crow clasped his hands together and studied me with that same unsettling calm. "What can I do for you, Mason?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "You can tell me exactly what you did to my wife." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "I've already explained how hypnosis works. I guided Elise through a process of self-discovery. Nothing more." "Bullshit," I snapped. "She's not the same. She talks about you like you're some kind of god. She dreams about you. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Crow sighed, his gaze softening. "Mason, I understand how this must look from the outside. But I promise you, Elise's journey wasn't about me. It was about her. She's not free," I growled. "She's trapped." Crow walked over to the window and stared out at the lake. "Elise was carrying a lot of pain when she came here. She was afraid to admit it, even to herself. That's why the experience felt so profound for her. I took a step closer, and you just happened to be the one to save her? Convenient." He turned back to me, his gaze sharp. "No one can save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Mason. I didn't make her trust me. She chose to." The room felt too small, too suffocating. I wanted to grab him, shake him, make him feel the pain he'd caused. But instead, I forced myself to take a deep breath. "She's not yours," I said quietly. Crow's expression softened again, almost pitying. "She never was. She's always been her own." I clenched my fists. "Then why does she feel like she belongs to you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "I think you've heard everything you came to hear." I stared at him for a long moment, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. But he was right about one thing. I couldn't force Elise to choose me. She had to want to come back on her own. Without another word, I walked out of the office, my chest tight with frustration and fear. As I drove home, the same thought echoed in my mind. How do you fight someone who lives inside the person you love? I didn't know the answer, but I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The drive home felt endless. The pine trees lining the highway blurred together as my mind raced, replaying every word Crow had said. She chose to trust me. His voice echoed in my head, calm and deliberate, like he knew exactly how to make himself sound blameless. But I wasn't buying it. Not entirely. Elise hadn't walked into that retreat as a blank slate. She'd gone there vulnerable, searching for something, anything, that made her feel stronger. And Crow? He'd become that something. He didn't save her. He rebranded her fears and dressed himself up as the cure. When I pulled into the driveway, Elise's car was already there. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I braced myself. I had no idea what I was walking into. Inside, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at her closed notebook. Her shoulders were slumped, and she didn't look up when I walked in. "Elise," I said softly. Her head lifted slowly. There was no anger in her eyes, just exhaustion. "You went to see him, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, I needed to understand." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mason, you shouldn't have done that." "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Because he might have told me the truth?" She shook her head. "No, because you've made this bigger than it is. I'm not obsessed with him." "Then why do you dream about him?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do you write about him like he's the only person who's ever understood you?" Her face crumpled at my words, and for a second, I thought I'd broken through. But then she steadied herself and took a deep breath. "It's not about him," she whispered. "It's about me." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then reached for the notebook and slid it across the table toward me. "Read it," she said quietly. I opened it, my heart pounding. The familiar fragments of thoughts were there, the ones I'd seen before. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed something I'd missed. Between the lines about Crow's voice and her sense of freedom were memories, things she'd never shared with me. Moments of doubt, fear, and loneliness. I didn't tell Mason how scared I was when we moved. I didn't want him to think I was weak. When the miscarriage happened, I felt like I broke something between us. I didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like a failure. The words blurred as my chest tightened. She wasn't writing about Crow. She was writing about herself. "Elise," I whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she met my gaze. Because I thought I had to be strong for you. You've always been the steady one, Mason. The one who fixes things, who keeps us moving forward. I didn't want you to see how lost I felt. My throat burned with guilt and grief. I'd spent so much time trying to be her anchor that I hadn't noticed she was drowning. You're not weak, I said, my voice shaking. You never have been. I should have seen it. I should have. It's not your fault, she interrupted. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself, let alone to you. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken pain pressing down on both of us. So what about him? I asked finally. What did Crow really do? Elise wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. He didn't put thoughts in my head, Mason. He just asked the questions I was too scared to answer. And for a while, I needed that. I needed someone to pull those things out of me, no matter how messy they were. I clenched my fists, trying to process it all. But why him? Why not me? Her face softened. Because I was afraid of disappointing you. My heart shattered at her words. You could never disappoint me. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and familiar. I know that now. But back then, I couldn't see it. I squeezed her hand tightly. I want to help, Elise. I don't want you to feel alone. Not ever again. A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded. I don't want to feel alone anymore either. We sat there, holding on to each other like we were afraid to let go. For the first time in weeks, it felt like she was really here, with me, not lost in her thoughts. But there was still one lingering fear in the back of my mind. Is he out of your head? I asked quietly. Elise hesitated for a moment before meeting my eyes. Almost. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was enough for now. The word almost hung in the air between us like a fragile thread. I nodded, though it felt like swallowing glass. Elise was here, with me, but part of her was still tangled in something I couldn't see or touch. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. I wanted to believe that she was on her way back to me, but almost wasn't enough. What if almost turned into never? Elise's soft breathing filled the room as she drifted off. I stayed awake waiting. A part of me hoped for silence. But just as I began to drift into a shallow sleep, it happened again. A soft murmur. Elijah. My entire body tensed. Hearing his name come out of her mouth felt like poison. I sat up slowly and stared at her peaceful face, illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. This had to end. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and headed to the living room. The room felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just me. I grabbed my phone and opened Crow's email. My thumb hovered over the screen as I contemplated sending another message. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my older brother, Caleb. He picked up on the third ring. Mason? It's midnight. Caleb, I need your help. There was a pause. I could practically hear him waking up. What's going on? You sound bad. It's Elise, I said, my voice tight. She went to this hypnosis retreat, and now she's different. She's trapped in her head, man, and I don't know how to get her back. Caleb let out a slow breath. Hypnosis? Jesus, Mason. That's heavy. I know. I ran a hand through my hair. I confronted the guy who ran it, Dr. Crow. But talking to him just made it worse. He's got her wrapped up in this emotional web, and I don't know how to break it. There was silence for a few seconds before Caleb spoke again. Do you trust me? I blinked. What kind of question is that? Just answer. Of course I do. Then listen to me. If this guy got inside Elise's head, you need to remind her of what's real. What's yours? The only way to beat this kind of thing is to replace whatever he planted with something stronger. You have to make her feel again, with you. His words hit me like a bolt of clarity. He was right. Crow's power came from making Elise believe she needed him to feel strong. But our life, the one we built together, that was real. That was stronger. Thanks, Caleb, I whispered. Anytime, he said. Go get her back. The next morning, I woke up determined. Elise was already sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, dressed in her favorite cozy sweater. The soft morning light made her look like the girl I fell in love with all those years ago. Elise, I said, sitting down across from her. She looked up, surprised by the intensity in my voice. Yeah, I want to take you somewhere. Her brow furrowed. Where? I smiled. You'll see. I drove us out to the lake where I proposed to her 6 years ago. The air was crisp, and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. Elise stepped out of the car and stared at the water, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Why here?" she asked softly. "Because this is where we started," I said, walking over to stand beside her. "This is where you said yes to me, where you chose us." She closed her eyes for a moment, taking it all in. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Do you remember this?" Her eyes widened as she recognized it. "Is that?" I nodded. "The letter you wrote to yourself before we got married." She had written it during a silly premarital counseling exercise, a letter to her future self, reminding her why she chose to build a life with me. I kept it all these years, even though we'd never opened it. I handed it to her. "Read it." She hesitated, her hands trembling, then slowly opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the page, and as she read the familiar words, tears welled in her eyes. "Dear Elise, you're about to marry your best friend. The man who makes you laugh when you're scared. The man who holds you steady when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Remember that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone every day, even when it's hard." She pressed the paper to her chest, her shoulders shaking as the tears came. "Elise," I said gently, placing my hands on her shoulders. "He didn't give you that strength. You've always had it, and you don't need him to remind you who you are." She looked up at me, her face wet with tears. "Mason, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how lost I was until now." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed. "You're not lost," I whispered. "You're right here." We stood there by the water for what felt like forever, wrapped in the quiet of the morning and the weight of everything unspoken finally being lifted. That night, for the first time in weeks, Elise slept soundly. There was no murmuring, no whispered name, just peace. As I lay beside her, watching her breathe, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Crow's shadow might have lingered for a while, but I'd found a way to pull her back into the light. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for sure. We were stronger together than anything he could ever plant in her mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up before Elise, and there was no tension in the air. No whispered names. No invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Just the soft hum of morning light filtering through the curtains and the steady rhythm of her breathing. I lay there for a moment, letting the peace settle over me. When Elise finally stirred, she opened her eyes and gave me a sleepy smile, the kind I hadn't seen in weeks. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning." There was something quiet and profound in that single word. It wasn't much, but it felt like we were rediscovering something familiar. Later that day, we went for a walk through the neighborhood. The chill in the air hinted at the coming winter, and the leaves crunched beneath our feet as we wandered side by side. There was still so much left unsaid, but not every conversation needed words. Eventually, Elise spoke. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "What happened at the retreat? What I let happen?" I stayed quiet, letting her sort through her thoughts. "I didn't realize how much of my life I'd spent pretending to be okay," she continued. "Crow, he made me feel seen in a way that scared me. He didn't save me, Mason, but he made me confront things I'd buried for so long." I nodded, processing her words. "I get that. I really do. But you know you didn't need him for that, right?" She stopped walking and turned to me, her eyes filled with something raw and real. "I know that now. I didn't need him. I needed you. I always did." Hearing her say that felt like the final piece of something broken clicking back into place. "I should have been there for you sooner," I said. "I thought being strong meant holding everything together. I didn't realize that sometimes being strong means asking the right questions and really listening." She stepped closer, her hand finding mine. "We both made mistakes, but I don't want to live in those mistakes anymore." Neither did I. A few weeks later, Elise sent an email to the retreat center. She requested that her contact information be removed from their mailing list and asked that Crow refrain from contacting her in the future. When she showed me the confirmation reply, I felt something inside me settle. The chapter was closing. We started going to couples counseling, not because we were broken, but because we wanted to rebuild stronger. The counselor wasn't some miracle worker. She didn't make grand promises or offer easy solutions. But she did give us a space where we could be honest, where Elise could talk about her fears without feeling like she had to carry them alone. In one of those sessions, Elise said something that stayed with me. I didn't lose myself at the retreat. I just forgot who I was for a while. That was the truth of it. Crow hadn't stolen her. He'd just given her a mirror that reflected back her own insecurities. But now, Elise had taken that mirror and shattered it herself. A few months later, we returned to the lake where I had taken her after everything fell apart. This time, there were no heavy silences or emotional walls between us. Just the sound of the water lapping at the shore and the warmth of her hand in mine. We sat on the edge of the dock, feet dangling over the water. Elise leaned her head against my shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "For not giving up on me." I kissed the top of her head. "We don't give up on each other. That's kind of our thing." She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the smile reached her eyes. "I don't think about Crow much anymore. His influence faded like a bad dream, one that leaves you shaken but makes you appreciate the morning light a little more." Elise's journey to heal wasn't easy, but she made it. We made it. I used to believe that strength meant never breaking. But I've learned that strength is something else entirely. It's what you find in the cracks when you put the pieces back together. In us, we're stronger now than we ever were before. The shadows don't scare us anymore, because we've seen the light.